front of this computer. Glad to be with you all. I'll start the old screen share and get things going. There we go. Always takes a minute to get started. Good to be with you all. So I did record last week's sort of introduction to Romans, but I haven't had a chance to upload it yet. So Karen, you have it. If you looked, you aren't missing anything. I haven't. I'm delinquent. I was headed out of town and didn't get a chance to do all that. So I'll upload last week's and this week's this afternoon, hopefully, and get them all up so people can catch up. And certainly I know Lynn was hoping to do that as well. All right, so some quick information about the church in Rome, and Roy had asked this question last time about sort of how did the church in Rome start, and that's basically, it was most likely a collection of small house churches. For that matter, even when we talk about the church in Corinth, it was likely a whole collection of smaller house churches, like there'd be a church meeting at Karen's house of 5 or 6 people that would pray together and spend time together, and there might be a group at Roy's house that are 5 or 6 or 10 people praying together and worshiping together. And from time to time, they would connect with each other and have larger events on bigger days, like say for Easter or for Christmas or for different events in the life of the community. Or when there was persecution and other things going on, all that would sort of link together. So when they say a letter to the church in Rome or to the church in Corinth or Thessalonica, it's not what we tend to think. Like, here's a big cathedral in the middle of the church, in the middle of the city. It was lots of small group communities that came together to pray together and worship together, but likely without a building. Most of them didn't have buildings until at least the 3rd, if not the 4th century. So then the gospel news spread to the major cities basically because of the trade network, right? It was easy. Rome, the one thing it did well was make both roads and safe passage across, as they called it, their lake, the Mediterranean Sea. And they would exchange all sorts of goods and services, and it was very common for people to hitch a ride or to pay a small fee to, go with the latest cargo from, well, it wouldn't be from Jerusalem, it'd be from the coast to Corinth, or you name from one place to another, right? And that's how all this tended to spread. And so the gospel spread very much through the trade network that Rome established. And as a result, that typically meant that the cities heard the news first, and it was typically within the synagogues. Because after all, the initial people who believed in Jesus were Jews. They were people who already understood the story, at least as far as who to expect for a Messiah. And then they could understand that this was the Messiah, right? So that it tended to start in the synagogues, and then gradually other people came into the conversation. But because this is how Rome worked, the idea of Christianity, the news, the gospel news, spread first in the cities. But those folks out in the countryside did not believe it. And there was a Latin term for those in the countryside who do not believe. Does anybody know what they are? Any idea? You've heard before, pagans. Pagos just means the country. So the people from the country were the pagans, the pagus. And it really just meant those folks in the countryside tend not to believe in the story of Jesus. But it was very much this combination, the same way we probably would now hear people talk about, making fun of people from small towns or from the country, right? They weren't as enlightened as the enlightened folks in the cities knew about Jesus, and the pagans out in the country didn't. What we do know about Rome, though, is that everything seemed to be going along fine for both the Jewish and Christian communities. Well, the Jewish communities have always been persecuted throughout history. Rome was no different. But we do know that Emperor or Caesar Claudius expelled the Jews in Rome in 49 AD, Impulsore Christo, which means because of the riots about Christ. They had obviously we had a situation in 49 AD where there were a group of Jews who believed in Jesus who fought those who did not believe in Jesus. And because they kept fighting and having various riots and battles, all of the Jews got kicked out of Rome in 49 AD, or at least that was the decree of Claudius. All right? But here's the reality. So sometime in there, in 40 AD, 50 AD, the Roman house churches were likely led by Gentiles, right? If all the Jewish folks started leaving, then those communities automatically had to be led by Gentiles, or you may have had some Jews who decided that they were no longer Jewish, that they were this new faith and they didn't have to leave. That is not as clear, but it's certainly clear that in 49, everything changed when Claudius kicked everyone out of Rome. Marcy just jumped on. Good to see you, Marcy.
Hi, sorry I'm late.
No worries. Glad you're here. You're here.
And so did he kick out all the Jews? Did he kick out just the Jews that believed in Christ?
No, he kicked out all the Jews.
All of them.
A common occurrence. If there's a problem, Rome didn't necessarily care who was right and who was wrong. They just knew that there was a group of Jews who believed in a Christos and a group that didn't believe in a Christos, and they were fighting each other. So they said, well, we don't want to deal with any of the Jews. If y'all are just going to fight with each other, get out. So they just kicked everybody out. And so that was the decree by Claudius in 49, that just all the Jews had to leave Rome because he was tired of them fighting in the streets, which also gives you a good idea of how well Jesus was received, right? Some folks were happy to hear that Jesus was the Messiah, and others were pretty violently against it. And it's not clear who started which fight, but obviously it was enough that it got to the emperor, and Caesar kicked them out of Rome. So the result, though, was the same either way. The Roman house churches were led by Gentiles after 50 AD, give or take, because all the Jews had been kicked out of town. Then, let's see. So it's hard to know exactly the ways that this changed things. There's not a list of things that they started to do after the Jews were kicked out that they weren't doing before, or vice versa. But we can guess, because Paul has to address some of these issues in the letter, right? So we can guess that the church likely stopped following kosher dietary laws. It looks like the earliest church probably kept kosher, but as it moved away from Judaism, people started giving that up. That's certainly what Peter's dealing with in the book of Acts, right? He starts to say, it doesn't matter, don't worry about eating bacon, I'm more concerned about you believing in Jesus. They started to worship on Sundays instead of Saturdays. It might have been many more beyond that, but we just know that the faith started to shift in how it observed Sabbath, how it observed all of these ideas and processes. And so the church started to change once the Jews were kicked out of Rome.
So, Bill, can I ask a question?
Sure.
The Jews that were kicked out of Rome, were they believers in Jesus and were kicked out, or were they Jews that did not that did not believe in Jesus and for some other reason were kicked out?
So this is one of those that what we can piece together, it's most likely both were kicked out. That is, there was a group of Jews who believed in Jesus, believed in the Christ, who were fighting openly in the street in some sort of violence in the city with Jews who did not believe that Jesus was the Christ. And there was literally this warring faction between those two communities, and the emperor just said, you know what? I don't want to deal with either of you. All the Jews get out. I don't care if you believe in Jesus or you don't believe in Jesus. I just don't want you bothering the peace of Rome.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, sure. Yep. So when Claudius died in AD 54, this is a fascinating thing about Roman law. When the emperor changed, then pretty much all the decrees of the previous emperor died with that emperor. So if the emperor said all Christians should be burned at the stake, then when he dies, that edict just sort of automatically ends unless the new emperor wants to continue. The new emperor was Nero, and he didn't really care if the Jews came back, so Jews started to come back in about 5 years after that initial decree. So you have 5 years of the church in Rome where the Jews were kicked out of Rome. Then they started to come back. That is where many Jews returned to Rome, and then likely new families came as well, because same as Washington, D.C., it's the capital, it's the center of power, the center of money and trade and commerce. So if you're wanting to make money, you probably would go to Rome. So the house churches then, those Roman house churches were likely struggling with this group of Gentiles who had stayed, who had been there for the last 5 years and been able to run the church. And so the hierarchy was likely different. There were likely Gentiles in charge of those communities. Then you have Jews who might have been faithful to that church that was there, that house church that was there, that are coming back. But now everything's different. It may not even be vaguely Jewish. When they left, it might have been almost fully Jewish, meaning in its practice, it might have been keeping kosher and honoring the Sabbath on Friday night to Saturday night, right? I mean, they might have had a very Jewish feel, but then once they left, it might have switched to a completely Gentile feel. So there's a lot of friction that's going on within the church. And we can tell that because of the way Paul addresses it and the way that the church sort of, the history that we have around it, right? That there's just this struggle. So Paul's letter to the church in Rome was likely written around 57, 58 AD. So about 5 years after everybody, 3 or 4 years after everybody can come back, and the community is still struggling, because what does it mean to be a church, a community gathered in the name of this new Christos, this Christ? And incidentally, Christos in Greek is just the Greek version of Mesach in Hebrew, which is the Messiah. In both cases, it means the anointed one, but Jesus as the anointed one, the chosen of God. All right, so that's some of the background for this letter. All of Paul's letters, actually, first questions about the background. I'll pause there just to see if y'all have any thoughts or comments or questions about that. That's to give you a broad idea of what's going on with the letter and the context. We'll talk more context too as we go along. All right. All of Paul's letters, now here's sort of just a general rule. All of Paul's letters were intended to be read in their entirety to the community, probably as a sermon or during worship. That is, they didn't always necessarily have an idea of this is the sermon time, the way we do, but there's certainly this idea that if there is a letter coming from Paul, it's important enough to be read as they also talk about Jesus and as they gather to have bread, as they remember Christ. So it was always meant to be read. It was an oral event, and that could be oral as in spoken and oral as in heard, A-U-R-A-L, right? So in many cases, most people believe Paul sent someone, or it's clear that he sent someone to deliver the letter, like physically hand it over, and to read the letter to the community, likely with instructions on how to unpack the letter, what words to emphasize as you read it. It may even have been, Paul may even have practiced with the person to make sure it was read in a specific way. Unfortunately, that's been lost to time, of course, but because it was understood as this event, as this thing that was going to happen, Paul wrote in a way that really meant to be heard more than it is the way we're going to look at it, which is to read one line by line and study the lines. It's really meant to be heard, which is why Paul a lot of times can seem insanely repetitive. He'll say things one way or two ways or three different ways or four ways, and it sounds like, well, that he just said the same thing 4 different ways. Yeah, he did say it 4 different ways, because if you're listening, it takes 2 or 3 times for us to hear what's being said, right? And so while it sometimes when you're reading Paul's letters, you go, wow, I feel like he's just repeating himself constantly. Well, it's true if you're reading the letter, but most people weren't literate. Most people didn't even have access to letter or paper or those kinds of things. So they just had to listen. And if they had to listen, then that, again, is a very different way of receiving the information. So when Paul writes something and tends to say, like, I am the deliverer of the gospel of Jesus Christ, of the one born and risen, of the, you go, well, okay, he said the same thing 3 times there, but it was to make sure that the community heard it and heard it clearly, right? Trying to get across exactly what he means through oral communication. Phoebe is mentioned later in the text as one that Paul commends to the Roman community as one with authority who can teach on his behalf. And so a lot of scholars believe that Phoebe is probably the one who also literally handed over the letter to the leaders in the church in Rome, to those house churches, and she was probably the one who also read the letter, if not performed the letter for the community. Hard to say. Phoebe is also one of those people who looms large in some of the conversations within the church. When the Episcopal Church was having arguments about should there be female clergy, Phoebe was one of those names that got brought up, that she very clearly is given important duties by Paul, and at least would be considered a deacon, if not a priest, in the modern context of the church. So Phoebe's one of those names that she's just sort of a glancing nod there toward the end of the text, but at the same time, she clearly is very important enough with Paul to trust with this important document. Okay. So, real quick, letters were common in the ancient world. People sent letters all the time. That wasn't new, but like Paul always tended to do, he took that model and he expands on it. That is, usually you would just have the opening of the letter, maybe not as simplistic as we have today, where you just say, "Dear Karen, hope you're doing well, love, Marcy," right? I mean, in the ancient world, it wasn't too dissimilar. You would start with both the, like, to Karen, my good friend. You might have another line or two, right? From Marcy in Sandy Springs, right? But Paul always took that as an extra chance to introduce himself and or the gospel, as well as to praise the community. So he would always just sort of lump a little more on. And again, part of it might just been because it was an oral story, so that he wanted to make sure that you heard who it was from and his credentials. The letter itself, though, was to be understood as an actual visit from the apostle. It was important enough that he had found the paper, he'd spent the time, he had prepared it, all those kinds of things, which again, in the ancient world it was an expensive process to find paper, to write the letter, and to send the letter, make sure it got from point A to point B. This was not the same difference as a quick note today. It was very much an event. And then the last thing, just to name, all of the letters, for that matter, the entirety of the New Testament are written in Greek, because that was the language of the empire. Thanks to Alexander the Great, who conquered the known world in the 4th century BC. That is around 330, all of the ancient world. That's from Egypt to India, or from Greece to India. That entire eastern half of the world was conquered by Alexander, and Greek was instituted as the main language. And so when Rome conquered the ancient world, they said, we'll just speak Greek because everyone knows it, and that's already the common language of the realm. So people want it to be Latin, but not a single book of the New Testament is written in Latin. Instead, it's written very much in the common language of the era, which would be Greek. Sort of like English is the common language for much of the business world. It was the same way in that ancient world. Greek had been for 3 centuries, 4 centuries by the time Paul rolls around, so why mess up anything good? All right, questions about the context and background? We'll jump in here now to the actual text. All right, here we go. So again, we'll keep discussing the context of Romans as we go. As always, stop me if something doesn't make sense. Stop and ask if you are wondering about what Paul means, because he uses a lot of turns of phrases that people have spent lots of time discussing. And sometimes we know, and sometimes we're just taking it on face value. But as always, it's how do we engage the story? Quick note that this is what, and I think she's right, Kathy Green, my professor on Romans, who's a professor at Virginia Seminary, and she was also my Greek professor. She's and she's been on just about every major Anglican communion, that is the larger church's theology conversations of the last 20 years. Her idea behind how to understand Romans, one of the keys to understanding Romans, is that Paul is writing to the Roman house churches partly to tell them of their role in the story that God is still writing. That is, Kathy understands Paul as constantly one who is trying to tell a story, and that's how we understand God, is not just that there was a story once upon a time, God created Adam and Eve, but for Paul, it is this ongoing story of salvation that comes even up to today, or in that case, to the churches in Rome. How is the Church of Rome part of the story of salvation of Jesus Christ in the world, right? And it's all a story, and we should always understand it as a story, not necessarily as what we would call in the post-Enlightenment world a history or anything like that, right? Like this happened on this day or that. No. The bigger thing is the story, and to understand the themes of the story and the meanings behind the story than it is to necessarily understand all the facts of the story at all times. Okay, so finally, after all of that, after a full class last week and the first half of this class this week, we get into the opening few lines. So we start with Paul. Of course, Paul, a servant of Jesus Christ, called to be an apostle, set apart for the gospel of God, which he promised beforehand through his prophets in the Holy Scriptures, the gospel concerning his Son, who was descended from David according to the flesh, and was declared to be the Son of God with power, according to the Spirit of holiness by resurrection from the dead, Jesus Christ our Lord, through whom we have received grace and apostleship to bring about the obedience of faith among all the Gentiles for the sake, including yourselves, who are called to belong to Jesus Christ. To all God's beloved in Rome, who are called to be saints, grace to you and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. How's that for an opening to a letter? Again, welcome to Paul. He never met a sentence without a dependent clause or sort of an explanatory aside included. All of his letters are like this, and it's why, especially when people are reading them in church, the letters sometimes can be incredibly confusing because here's a dependent clause, here's an explanatory aside. He goes in every direction. Again, this is just literally the first sentence of the letter. This is Paul writing to God's beloved in Rome. So, first, Paul is super clear in his writings that everyone has to serve somebody. And the fascinating thing, this is one of those that I love about how people translate it, I guess because they don't like the idea of what Paul is saying. But Paul says very clearly he's not a servant to Jesus. He is a slave, a doulos in the Greek. He is a slave to Jesus. He owes everything. He owes Jesus everything and serves him as one who is indebted to Jesus, right? So that opening line that gets translated by the New Revised Standard Version, oh, I am a servant of the Lord. No, Paul would say, I am a slave of the Lord. I'm a slave of Jesus because he turned me around. He put me on the right path. And so I owe Jesus. I owe him my authority, my very being, quite frankly. Read Paul and all of his letters, he's clear on that, right? And Paul's super clear that the same way that Bob Dylan would say in his song, I gotta serve somebody, everybody has to serve somebody. We think that that's not true, especially in the 21st century, but Paul was super clear about it back in those days. Bob Dylan was super clear about it and gotta serve somebody. Everyone is the same. Just to unpack that a little, so folks love to say, especially in our world, oh, I'm independent, I make my own choices, I'm free to do what I want to do. But Paul's super clear that we all have to serve. We all have to serve. It's just to say it differently, we're free to choose, so we are free to choose who we serve. But no one can make it in this world without being connected to someone else and needing help along the way. And so Paul is clear in that understanding, and for that matter, so is the Bible, that you have to make your choice. The great mistake we make, if you read Exodus, people love to say like, oh, Moses wanted to set his people free. He did. He wanted to get them out of slavery in Egypt, but he very clearly says, I want them to be free to choose between the gods of Egypt or the God of Israel. They're going to keep on serving somebody, but is it going to be the God of Egypt or the gods of Egypt or the God of Israel? Right? We tend to look at it, again, we sort of have that American idea of freedom and freedom to choose. But Paul would literally laugh in our faces and say, yeah, that's nice. You're just choosing which person you serve, but that does not mean anyone is free in this life from working with someone else or being engaged with someone else or being part of a community. And that in every case, they demand everything from you, one way or another. It's a big idea. Let me pause there. We're one half of a clause into Paul's letter. Anybody have questions about being a slave to Jesus or being a slave to, I don't know, the United States? And to use those terms, but it's definitely the terms that Paul would understand. Sometimes Paul would call these the powers and principalities of the world. That is, God's always in charge. He's over the powers and principalities, but those powers and principalities are groups that we serve. That is, we might be serving our company as an employee, right? That's a lesser power or principality of the world, but Lord knows those businesses, those jobs demand your time and energy and effort, right? Even if they're paying you, they still demand that you serve them in their own way. If you say, well, I am an American, well, America has her requirements as well on you, right? That's another power and principality, a lesser being than God, but someone who demands our time and energy as well. That's how Paul would understand the world. And actually, that's how I understand the world, I'll be honest. If you're really honest about what's going on and looking around, I think that's a closer reality to what's going on than when people sort of think that they can just go do whatever they want anytime they want. And then are usually surprised when they get fired, right? Things change and they suddenly go, why is everyone so mad at me? I'm free to do what I want. You're like, well, not without repercussions. Okay, so we could literally get bogged down and spend days, weeks looking at every single line. Paul makes lots of those theological claims throughout the text. And intentionally, his job is really to connect Jesus to the stories of Judaism and how they continue to the present, right? So he talks about that in that intro of who he is. But what I want to do today with our time left is to go ahead and move to the mission statement, the thesis statement, if we would say, if we were back in our English classes back in the day, for Romans. And that can be found in verses 16 through 17. First, we have a little sort of continuation. Paul has introduced himself, then he has written and said, oh, I'm so excited to be talking to my friends in Rome. And now he has another additional line. First, I thank my God through Jesus Christ for all of you, because your faith is proclaimed throughout the world. Who knows if that's true? That might just be Paul laying it on thick, as we say, right? He might just be saying, you guys are the best. No more faithful folks than you. For God, whom I serve with my spirit by announcing the gospel of his Son, is my witness that without ceasing I remember you always in my prayers, asking that by God's will I may somehow at last succeed in coming to you. For I'm longing to see you so that I may share with you some spiritual gift to strengthen you, or rather so that we may be mutually encouraged by each other's faith, both yours and mine. I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that I have often intended to come to you, but thus far have been prevented, in order that I might reap some harvest among you as I have among the rest of the Gentiles. I am a debtor both to Greeks and to barbarians, both to the wise and to the foolish. Hence my eagerness to proclaim the gospel to you also, who are in Rome. So, Paul was prevented to come to Rome by various arrests and the work to manage the communities in the eastern portion of the empire. We learn all that in Acts. And this is a just general description of Paul's desire to visit Rome. He wants to preach and teach in Rome. He wants to bring more folks into the church. No, and again, Paul's very clear that his message is typically to Gentiles, that's where it tends to receive the most. So he will describe himself even as an apostle to the Gentiles, that while he is a Pharisee and a Jew, he tends to do his best work with those who are not Jews. So he's going to come and spend his time there in Rome to do two things: to proclaim the gospel, to learn from each other, and then ultimately he'll say later on, oh yeah, and to raise some money so I can go start churches in Spain, in Gaul, as they would call it, France and Spain, in that western portion of the empire. He wanted to make sure that the gospel was spread to what was then the known world, the Roman world. Questions about Paul's introductions there or his comments? All right. Here we go then. So here is the thesis statement for Paul for the entire gospel. And everybody, anyone you read, any scholar you read will agree that this is what Paul is trying to do in the totality of the letter of Romans. For I am not ashamed of the gospel. It is the power of God for salvation to everyone who has faith. Jews first, and also to the Greek. And Greek and Gentile are used pretty interchangeably. For in it, the righteousness of God is revealed through faith for faith. As it is written, the one who is righteous will live by faith. All right, for I'm not ashamed of the gospel. It is the power of God for salvation to everyone who has faith. To the Jew first, and also to the Greek. For in it, the righteousness of God is revealed through faith, for faith. And as it is written, the one who is righteous will live by faith. If you didn't catch everything Paul's doing, welcome to Paul. He is both completely clear and always a little obtuse. And not intentionally obtuse. I think he's just using terms in a very specific way. The good news is, for the rest of the book, he will be explaining this idea over and over again. So what we'll do real fast is take it apart. First, Paul is not ashamed of the gospel. Paul is proud of the gospel, right? But it could mean four different things when he says he's not ashamed of the gospel. That is, he could be actually proud of the gospel. I'm not ashamed, I'm proud of it, right? He could also be saying that some think that he should be ashamed, either because they don't understand the gospel or because it's scandalous, right? I mean, literally, Jesus is one who is an abomination according to Jewish law. One who is hung on a tree is one who is unclean. And so there is this idea that perhaps in Jewish circles, the message of Jesus should be one that brings you shame because he died a shameful death. So Paul is responding to that, perhaps. Or it could be that Paul is ashamed that the God appears to abandon the covenant of Israel, that here's this new promise through Jesus to the larger world. So what about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, about the deals made first, the promises made first to Israel and to Judaism? So some people think that Paul might be saying that, again, maybe he should be ashamed of the gospel, but he's going to unpack why he's not ashamed, why he doesn't think that's a problem. Or it could also draw on the Psalms that say, I shall not be put to shame, right? We've heard that in the Psalms, hopefully. I shall not be put to shame because God is drawing near. That's because God is going to prove that God is up to something bigger. There's a bigger deal going on here than what you think, and so you won't be shamed. You will not be put to shame because God is going to help out and explain everything. Again, this is how detailed we get into descriptions and comments in the gospel, in Paul's letters, because there's so many people who have commented for 2,000 years on a handful of words that we end up looking at it in much, much more detail, certainly maybe than Paul even meant. My pages are sort of messing up here. Anyway, so it is the gospel is the power of God for salvation is the next line. Kathy Green notes that the power in Greek is dynamis or dynamos, which gives us the word dynamite. So it is, I think it's fair to translate, and this is how Kathy would also translate it. It's likely appropriate to say that the gospel is God's explosive word, is explosive world-changing power, right? That this is what God is sharing in the gospel changes everything, and we should think of it as explosive as dynamite and revolutionary, right? There's not a whole lot left after dynamite goes off. God's power in the world, when it explodes, means that everything gets undone and then redone. So Kathy is the one who put that quote down there. Kathy Green, God's explosive world-changing power is how Paul understands the gospel. Note, and this is important, right? When Paul writes it, he says it, or the gospel, which he just referenced, the gospel is the power of God for salvation. Not that God's power is revealed, or other ways of saying it, but instead it's that the gospel itself is the power of God. That in holding the gospel and having those stories, we have a certain power in the world, a more powerful way of seeing things, a more powerful way of understanding things, a revolutionary way of seeing salvation that is not true for anyone else. That's Paul's fundamental understanding of the gospel, that it is in that story that we see the power of God. We see God's movement to change the world and make it right. Okay? It's all of my stuff. It's all my stuff. Anyway, the important words for Paul also are two words within this. Faith is one of them, and righteousness is the other. And both of them are words that we can trip up on, partly because they've been used for thousands of years in ways that aren't necessarily the way Paul meant them, and part of them also because English doesn't hold them well. That is, so for Greek, the word pistis can be used both as a noun and a verb. That is, I have faith in Jesus, that is a noun, but then also I can faith in, or I can trust in. So you, the closest probably English cognate, that is a way that can be used. In the ancient Greek, pistis could also be to put your trust in. So I can have trust in God, and then I can put my trust in God, right? That idea is there for faith. And so sometimes it will get translated, because English is awkward like this, as faith as a noun, and then we believe, but it's actually the same word in Greek. And that Paul then sometimes is playing a little bit of word games with that. But to have faith is to put your trust in, is to believe in, is to absolutely act on what you have this sort of cognitive knowledge of. We would say believe, but instead it's more of an active verb. Believe tends to be a little bit more passive in its English connotations, while Paul means much more, no. To have faith is to act on what you understand, right? To have that faith is to put your trust in, is to act upon what God is promising. The other word that we talked about a good deal last week is righteousness, dikaiosune, but righteousness is the legal term for being proved correct or faithful. So it can be justified, but that doesn't necessarily have all the power that righteousness has. It's also justice for Israel. So God's power to set the world right, to set things right, is this idea behind righteousness. God's righteousness is his declaration that this is the way things are supposed to be versus the way they are. So the righteousness of God is about setting things to right, and faith is understanding that God can do that and then acting because of it. So they're intimately related for Paul, and they're used a lot, as we just saw in those opening words and sentences, right? So Paul notes, again, when we get into those phrasing, that he has come to share this power, and it comes first to Judaism, to receive God's power in the gospel, that the Jews heard it first. But he also notes that God is impartial in sharing this with the Gentile. It's not, he shares it first with Jews, and then later, in fact, instead he says it's first with Judaism and also with the Gentiles, So it's God is even in his revelation of the gospel to everyone who is going to receive it. The next word that gets used a lot then is God's righteousness is being revealed to the world. And in Greek, it's apokaleptai. There we go. Which is the root word for apocalypse. So Paul understands this as an apocalypse. It reveals all things. Apocalypse does not mean the end of the world. It literally just means to reveal what's going on. An apocalypse is when we finally understand everything that's going on in the world, not the whole world has been destroyed in nuclear holocaust. That's not the understanding that Paul has when he talks about apocalypse. Instead, apocalypse is God is finally explaining what God's up to, and now it all makes sense. All right. Whew. So, what is revealed? God is revealing God's own covenant faithfulness to the gospel. God is revealing God's own covenant faithfulness to the gospel, which is the world-changing event of God's power for salvation, the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. That's how Kathy Grebe sort of reconfigures that sentence. God is revealing God's own covenant faithfulness, that is his promise to Israel, and the faithfulness that he has through the gospel, which is the world-changing event of God's power for salvation, the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And Romans will tell us this story again and again and again until we get it, until we believe its power, until more than we believe it, we will act on it and change our lives. Conversion. All right. So that's, I'm going to go back real quick. Where did it go? What is revealed? Do that thesis statement so we can look at it for a second. Again, I am not ashamed of the gospel. It is the power, the dynamite of God for salvation to everyone who has faith, or to everyone who believes, or to everyone who has put their trust in God. To the Jews first, also to the Greek, to the Gentiles. For in it, righteousness of God is revealed. That is the faithfulness of God and the power of God to set all things right is revealed, is apocalypse. Through faith, for faith. That is, we believe all of this, or we can see all of this through our faith and for the growth of our faith. Or it could also be read through the faith of those who are around Jesus for our faith. That way we're continuing in that story. It could also be through the faithfulness of Jews to grow the faithfulness of the Gentiles. All of those will be touched on in different parts of Paul's letter to the Romans. For as it is written, and this comes from Habakkuk, the one who is righteous will live by faith. The one who is justified, the one who is proven right by God will live by faith. This is important because for Paul, we'll see in a little while that this is also something different than one who is justified by actions. That is, one who spends all their time living into the Mosaic laws and those rules. You aren't justified for Paul. You aren't proven righteous because you lived according to the kosher rules. You were justified because you believe in God and because God loves you first. Okay, so that's a whole lot, and it's deep. I promise. It gets much more interesting once we get into the arguments. We're setting the stage for next week and for getting into Paul starting to tell the story of how he understands this faith to be worked out. Questions, thoughts, comments?
Bill, this may be a great grasp of the obvious, but is it correct to assume that all of the Jews and the Gentiles in Rome, the church in Rome, all of them knew who Paul is? Paul's name, and this is 50 some odd years, I think you said, after the resurrection that Paul wrote the letter. Mm-hmm. I believe you said that.
Yeah, so no, it's probably 58 AD, but that's a good 20 years 20 to 30 years after the resurrection. So it's not 50 years, but it's a good span of time has happened. And Paul's work is probably pretty well known. It's not clear how much he's known in the Church of Rome, but later at the end of the book, he lists about 20 or 30 people that he knows in the church in Rome. So you get the idea that if you didn't know, it was just because you were a newer convert to the faith than if you had been around for a while.
Okay. I mean, I assume here comes a letter from Paul, and everybody pretty much knows who he is, or and you know, they call the faithful together. Here's this letter. It must be important. He must be important for everybody to get together to listen to a letter.
Yes, I think it is fair to say that a decent number of the people have an idea of who he is. Probably, like everything, not everybody, because it doesn't matter what church you're in, people tend not to know, right? Sometimes
Right.
don't pay any attention. But I think it's fair to say a lot of people knew who he was.
Okay. Thanks.
Sure. Yeah, Paul looms large at this point. He wrote this towards the end of his ministry. And conservative estimates would say that Paul has probably traveled some 10,000 miles by foot, chariot, or boat at this point, spreading the gospel of Jesus in the eastern part of the empire. So his name is probably one that the community at least had an idea of. He's that guy who's out there doing stuff, but not necessarily a personal knowledge.
Okay.
Other questions or thoughts?
This shows my lack of Bible knowledge. Did Paul ever make it to Rome?
Paul did make it to Rome, but he was under lock and key, so it's not clear if he ever actually connected with the church in Rome. But he appealed to Caesar. That was if you were accused of anything, of a crime, as a citizen of Rome, you could appeal directly to the emperor. He did so, and so he was taken in chains at one point to Rome. And then it gets a little murky. It's more tradition. It's not written in it's not written in Acts or anything like that, but that Paul most likely was put to death. He made it to Rome, and the emperor said, yeah, whatever, and killed him. But all of that's more oral tradition and later history than it is within our text. So it's hard to say. And certainly there's not any record that we have that says while he was in Rome under house arrest, he made it to those, house churches of Rome to talk to the faithful or anything like that. Most scholars think that because this is sort of how that worked, you were typically under a sort of house arrest. They didn't have big, like we do now, they didn't have giant prisons. They tended just to have enough prisons to hold a handful of people, and either they put you to death or they put you to work and made you a slave, or they let you go, right? There wasn't a long process. And there certainly was nothing that we would have now. The ancient world just didn't have that. Like, again, you were either a slave and put into the salt mines, literally, or killed, or they let you go, kind of thing. So he might well have been sort of under house arrest and connected. And most people think that there was likely at least some connection where, whether it was Phoebe who was helping in the Church of Rome or something like that, when he got there, they had some conversation. It's just not clear if he really got to preach and teach the way he wanted to once he got there or not. All right, my friends. Well, next week we will jump into Paul's argument, and we'll have lots more time to sort of go back and forth about what Paul does or doesn't mean. This is the stuff where he's setting the course. So we'll do that. Glad you came, Kit. Hope to see you next week. Glad you were with us. All right, my friends. Everybody have a great day, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you, Bill.
You guys too. Thanks so much.
Bye.
Bye.